will be Professor Gardner from the American University of Paris. He will speak about the return of the political warfare.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Is my PowerPoint working, or is it not going to happen? Okay. I will compliment, I hope, the previous speaker. I believe I will be talking more about the covert aspects of the manipulation of anti-state actors, and I make a distinction between anti-state actors and NGOs, because anti-state actors are those who are militantly opposed to a specific state or states. And I really don't like Al-Qaeda referred as an NGO. It just never made sense to me, and I see it in almost every textbook. So I react against that. However, I will talk about this. So this is called The Return of Political Warfare. It's a critique of what I think what's happening now, from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period. Which button do I push? Do I name it? So, all right, hang on. Which is, I'm not very technical. What do I have to name? It's working. I probably turned it on. So what I'll be doing here is talking a bit about hybrid warfare, moving from more traditional covert. Oh, okay. I don't want to get too much into details, but my main point is Clausewitz is usually misinterpreted. His war of continuation of politics by other means is the cliche. If you look at what he says later on war, it's the war is nothing but the continuation of political intercourse or political communications, politischen Verkehrs, with the intervention of other means. And in order to assert at the same time that this political intercourse is not stopped by the war itself. In other words, he's seeing war as a continual diplomacy. It is not simply something that you do in order to just defeat the enemy. There's a dialogue going on even in the middle of war. Next. Oh, words. Where do I push though?
And the next one.
Right one? Oh, this one. Sorry. Yeah, I really. Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay. I'll just make them up. Okay, so I've already said this. A dilemma is that opponent is capable of fighting back once the war starts, and then if compromises can be made, one or two more sides may be drawn. So the point is this political interaction, engaging in looking for compromises over time, or pushing your own will to its advancement. So his famous Trinity. First, the blind natural force of violence. Second, interaction of chance, probability, uncertainty. And the main point I'm making here is war's rational subordination to the policy of the government, which may change. That policy may change in the course of the conflict and in interaction with the opponent's actions and policies. So you set up a strategy, but you may not be able to actually achieve that strategy depending on the outcome and depending on the interaction with the opponent. The diplomacy must adapt itself to the chosen means, a process that can radically change that strategy. So the key point here is when we move from political warfare, which I'll leave to George Kennan in just a second, to hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is undermining that fundamental dictum that political communications and diplomacy must not be stopped by the war itself. Right out of Clausewitz. But we are engaging in a point where we're no longer, our war is acting in such a way that we're no longer engaging in political communications with Russia, or even to a certain extent with China. We're beginning to communicate with North Korea, but I'm afraid there are other issues, right? So, and such warfare purposely, the problem with hybrid warfare as it's developed, and I'll talk about that in a second, purposely augments elements of uncertainty and thus makes it even more difficult to bring the conflict under rational control for political or diplomatic ends. And the last point is that anti-state tactics of the post-2001 global war on terrorism are beginning to be adopted by the major powers. But those major power rivalries are beginning to merge with the global war on terrorism. thereby opening the door to wider conflicts, if not major power war. There was a question earlier about the war on terrorism. It's a disaster. It's a disaster. It's costing us trillions of dollars. It starts in Afghanistan. It spreads to Iraq. It spreads to North Africa. It is spreading to Afghanistan again. It is a disaster. And to even think that it's going to end is another issue. But the problem is it's merging with the greater power rivalries with China, for example, in Xinjiang province, or Russia, the Caucasus, and other areas of Central Asia, and Syria. So, George Kennan was the founder, you could argue he started the concept of political warfare from the logical consequence of Clausewitz's doctrine in time of peace. Now, he's defined it in the Cold War terms that we use political warfare in a time of peace. Political warfare is employment of all means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national directives. Such operations are both overt and covert. They're alliances, they're the Marshall Plan, they're the white propaganda and black propaganda and covert operations. Now, my concept is strategic leveraging. It just draws on this and basically the same concept, simply that I try to systematize it, and the computer made a nice little diagram there, so I stole it. So the strategic alliances, military, technology, financial, political, economic, etc., media, propagandistic, all are tools that states can use to assert their interests. But they can expand, sustain, or even retract their interests. There's no necessity to always expand, as the traditional realist says. And then, depending on the nature of these interactions and negotiated compromises, will determine whether we maintain a global equipoise or enter into a new period of conflict. Now, what's interesting here is how Kennan himself argued that the British Empire had survived because of political warfare. Lenin had synthesized Marx and Clausewitz. And the U.S. up at that time had been reluctant to engage in political warfare, but was beginning to think about it in more realistic terms, overcoming this artificial division between peace and war. As I said, we're in a period of peace, but it's a continuation of war by other means. Okay. And what was new was the covert aspects of the warfare. Now, what's interesting is how he synthesizes anti-state movements with major power movements. On the one hand, the British Empire and the Soviet Union are two examples of political warfare, but he mentions the communist Abraham Lincoln Brigade and in the Spanish Civil War, and this is his quote, illegal Zionist activities in Israel and elsewhere. And these would provide the models for organized U.S. public supported resistance of tyranny in foreign countries to further national interests, American national interests. Okay, and then he proposed a director of political warfare. Now, he went on to, now we jump ahead, we call what I call strategic levering or new forms of political warfare. We find the U.S. beginning to engage in a strategy of containment, forging a NATO, Japanese, Chinese, Saudi encirclement towards the end of the Cold War. We'll come back to that in a minute in the post-Cold War period, because China is no longer in that equation. But as the United States reached out to China in the late 70s, the Soviet Union started screaming encirclement. The United States supported solidarity. The United States supported the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You can go down the list of movements. Religion was an important tool of strategic leveraging. Afghan and Islamic resistance in Afghanistan, recognition of the Vatican in 1984, Jewish refuseniks and Christian fundamentalists inside the Soviet Union. All these were there to undermine atheist Soviet ideology. This was coupled with a strategy of horizontal escalation, which was argued we could counter Soviet advances since the Vietnam War, so-called geopolitical gains in countries like Nicaragua or Mozambique or others, even though with our forward nuclear deployments, and that's where we get the problem today. Strategic strategy of horizontal escalation argued it was possible to counter Soviet geopolitical gains with the development of a nuclear first strike capability combined with forward weapons deployments, including the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe to counter Soviet intermediate-range SS-20s, coupled with the threat of stealth and Star Wars, the two systems that the United States was going to develop at that time, but hadn't developed them, but has developed them in the present situation. So we've gone beyond the 1980s in that sense. Now, in this period of uncertainty, we came very close to nuclear war. September 1983, the Soviets saw incorrectly reported launch of multiple Minuteman anti-carrier missiles, and the NATO Able Archer exercises November 83 also raised fears of a first strike. Now, my point is that that's part of Clausewitz's theory. This role of accident uncertainty in war is a key thing that the strategists have to take into account. They can't just ignore the possibility that something could go wrong. Okay, despite these accidents and the near accidents, we go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which came very close to missile. There were times in the Korean War in 1950, we can go down a whole list of them. The United States was able to achieve its rational objectives. The 1987 INF Accord was crucial to that, and pressed Moscow to do what the United States wanted it to do, which was withdraw its forces in Eastern Europe, undermining the Warsaw Pact, promising Gorbachev and later that we would not expand NATO, getting the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, and obtaining the political goal of German unification within NATO. Now, what's interesting here, and I'm going to talk about it later, is it's not clear U.S. containment policy expected the collapse of the Soviet Union. And while ruling out the possibility of a neutral Germany, which George Kennan has supported in 1949, or even a neutral Japan, the doctrine was to keep Japan in U.S. alliance, but also to bring Germany into a full alliance in NATO. I'll talk about that in a minute. The NSC 68 doctrine came out. It was under Paul Nitze, came out of after George Kennan. It militarized containment, but it still argued the successful conduct of a policy of containment. We always leave the possibility of negotiation open. This is the point we're missing today, I think, Trump policy. Foreign economic policy. Note that in NSC 68, it says it's a way you could shape favorably to the U.S. and its welfare. It is also an instrument which, unwisely formulated and employed, could do actual harm to our national interests. That's happened. Now the point, this is why I say the United States Cold War policy at its roots in 1950 was not to undermine the Soviet Union. NSC 68, the goals did not include unconditional surrender, the subjugation of Russian peoples, or a Russia shorn of its economic potential. Such a course would irrevocably unite the Russian people behind the regime that enslaves them. Rather, these objectives contemplate Soviet acceptance of the specific and limited conditions requisite to an international environment in which they could operate. Well, my point is that NSC 68 sought to militarize containment in such a way, but still maintain communications with the Soviet Union and make geopolitical goals short of all-out war. In that situation, it remained in the Clausewitz doctrine. Immediately after the Cold War, our goal, this was talked about earlier in the previous session, was to bring a democratic Russia and other new democracies into the defense community of democratic nations so they can begin to become a force for peace, not only in Europe, but in other critical regions of the world. We also talked about this. The United States has consistently tried to keep the European Union from forming a larger defense integration that would undermine NATO, and particularly its integrated command structure. This is right out of the document. There were earlier variations of this document that were even stronger than that. That conceived Germany and Japan become hostile to the United States. Okay, so now notice this original document right after the Cold War did not envision NATO enlargement. It envisioned extending to East European states security commitments analogous to those extended to the Persian Gulf. That would have been a very different scenario. We talked about that this morning. Very different scenario had NATO taken this option rather than the later option adopted by the Clinton administration in the period from December 1994 until 97 or 90. Okay. I went back. Okay, I don't want to, we're going to go. Anyway, okay. So no attempt, there was no, political strategy was not to extend NATO at that time until 1994. But once, what's interesting here is both George Kennan and Paul Nixon would come out against NATO enlargement by 1997. They were the founders of containment, the two. And President Clinton refused to listen to any of these former highly qualified individuals to deal with this subject. That's the subject. So the point is that there were options that weren't pursued in order to say, as was spoken about, either bringing Russia into a larger community of nations, a Euro-Atlantic community. All right. But the fault line is not just with NATO. The EU would also expand without including Russia as well. So it's a double enlargement that would result in Russian alienation by 2008. All right. Now, the other point is, in the meantime, before we get to hybrid warfare, the problem is we take a highly ideological term of democracy promotion. That starts with the support of democratic movements in Eastern Europe, the support for Boris Yeltsin, support for anti-Milosevic movements, support for color revolutions. And immediately after 2001, though, while we're supporting these democratic movements, destabilizing countries, I was in China during Tiananmen Square. I saw the crackdown. I heard Voice of America supporting the movement very strongly, and I understand why the Chinese think we're trying to undermine their society. So I disagree with it because there was possibilities for reform if the Chinese did. Under Zhao Ziyang, if the Chinese did accept it. Now, I'll skip through most of the anti-state terrorism thing, but the point is that these movements, these anti-state terrorist movements, Al-Qaeda began to be adopted into new techniques of hybrid warfare and using both discriminate and indiscriminate violence. My favorite expression is we've adopted a hit, Al-Qaeda adopted a hit but not run strategy. You destroy, who cares who dies. The idea is to create a martyrdom that will generate new followers. And obtaining strategic footholds in Palestine, Sudan, Chechnya, Afghanistan, etc. Xinjiang province, I forgot, China. All these are part of some of these Islamic goals, but there are other groups that also want to create independence movements as well. Otherwise, they'll run out of time to get to the meeting. Yeah, these are just some examples of anti-state terrorism, problems with anti-state terrorism. Okay, now here, the problem is the global war of terrorism begins the merge of major power political warfare. At least not since 1999, after the war of Kosovo, and the United States, in effect, didn't overthrow Milosevic during that war. It took a movement, supported a democracy movement to try to overthrow Milosevic after the war was over. In many ways, the war solidified Milosevic's position. But the point is, U.S. political war risks the possibility that a Russia shorn of its economic potential could unite the Russian people. And this was originally because of its refusal or reluctance to draw Russia into a larger Euro-Atlantic alliance. But Russia begins its own reverse form. You mentioned that the Russians, the Iranians, have their own NGOs now. But they began to use their own techniques of democracy promotion in the 2004 election in Ukraine. They didn't win at that time. Yushchenko, the EU and US supported candidate, won, but Yanukovych would win in 2010, backed by Moscow. Furthermore, it began a more sophisticated technique of political warfare. They call it nonlinear warfare. with its seizure of Crimea and Little Green Men. Russia engaged in this what I call reverse democracy engineering to roll back the Orange Revolution, to put Yanukovych in power before the Maidan movement began to arise. And then, though, once Moscow seized the Crimea, during the instability created during that period, it uses its own form of democratization by a very hastily conceived and narrow referendum. We talked about democracy, and referendums aren't democratic. There are only two choices on that particular referendum, and usually they're yes or no questions, which are just absurd. So Moscow began to use nonlinear warfare to counter both NATO and the EU, all different men, whether it's cyber attacks or the placing of nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and Crimea. The idea is to destabilize and offset the West, U.S. and Europe. I'm always doing this. So, I keep jumping ahead. Sorry about that. So, some of this seizure of Crimea itself took place in the middle of NATO major nuclear warfare maneuvers. There was a propaganda campaign that they were going to support Russian diaspora in the Baltic states. Now the threats to deploy nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and Crimea. Tactical nuclear weapons are seen as a means to de-escalate conflict, not to prevent conflict. Moscow is taking advantage of the fact, and here's the problem of American hegemony. America is dispersed over the globe. It doesn't mean it can control every single region. So Russia was able to pick the hole and climb out in Crimea, and it's picked a hole in Syria, and now it's beginning to integrate try to link the Crimea, Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean, strategically and economically. So, furthermore, during the Ukrainian conflict, Moscow no longer appears to be wanting a new Russia that would link the Crimea to Odessa and Transnistria. That's certainly what was talked about at the time, at the beginning of the conflict. Those goals are too high, and I would argue that Russia can't achieve or wouldn't be able to achieve those. The cost would be too great, and occupation would be too great. The point is, Russian goals are regionally revanchist, not globally revanchist so far. The main tool of Russia is its alliance with China since 2005. We mentioned that earlier, that China did participate in the military maneuvers with Russia just recently. They've been participating in the military maneuvers in the East China Sea, in the Mediterranean, and the Baltic as well. Almost finished. That is the idea. I should have some music or something. Okay, here's the key point though. This new encirclement, China is its balancing position to prevent China from ever again becoming linked to NATO and the EU and linked to the US alliance as it did in the 1980s. And China itself doesn't want the US and Europeans, as was just mentioned, to form an alliance that could be with Russia that could be turned against China. So this is what I call a Neo-Rapallo pact dating from the interwar period. The two isolated states are trying to link together to balance each other. Furthermore, an alliance with Iran, and this is why the administration, Trump's administration is focusing on Iran, because China and Russia are beginning to draw Iran into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Trump administration wants to break that. Okay. Furthermore, unexpected consequence of this, or unexpected, but is that the Syrian diaspora helps fuel the xenophobia and nationalism in the EU, and Moscow's in fear that a number of pan-Islamic movements will be able to take advantage of the collapse of the Assad regime. So this has solidified Moscow behind this horrendous regime. Okay, furthermore, pan-Islamic movements in Xinjiang province are being cracked down on very strongly, so that there's a new repression going on in China against the religious differences. This, as I mentioned already, there's the fear of encirclement, but there's also a mutual opposition to democracy movements inside both Russia and China, and these are bringing Russia and China together as well. And this, as I said, I was in China during Tiananmen Square. This fear of multi-party U.S. support for multi-party democracy is one of the major factors that's militarizing the Chinese. Okay, we already talked about that. Sorry? Oh, yeah, 1 minute, I'm finished. That's why I'm skipping those. Okay, now here's the dilemmas. Hybrid warfare can use legal and illicit tactics and both military and non-military actions that directly impact and involve populations. It likewise involves new techniques of cyber sabotage, and certainly the accusations, proof of Russian interference in the American elections, the French elections, and others, is intensifying the animosity between the two sides that Clausewitz talks about. So that animosity is growing. You can feel it in the United States. I was just back in the United States. You can feel it. Anything that's reasonably sound like a pro-Russian sentiment, it's quite put down. So the adoption of illicit, non-conventional methods by legitimate state leaderships makes it generally more difficult for those leaderships to sustain plausible deniability. This raises deeper suspicions of intent while concurrently undermining trust and possibility of negotiated settlements. The Russians accuse the Americans of interfering in the Ukrainian elections, and the Russian national elections themselves, the use of cyber warfare against Iranian computers involved in nuclear development in the Obama administration. These are the kind of issues that are creating this tension and animosity between the sides. So my point is that hybrid warfare contradicts Clausewitz's fundamental dictum that political communications must not be stopped by the war itself. The danger is not merely that states are adopting tactics of anti-state terrorist movements, but as both Russia and China begin to assert their regional and global interests versus the U.S., NATO, EU, and Japan, clashing major power interests are beginning to interface in the ongoing war on terrorism. We already saw near clashes between Turkey and Russia, the U.S. and Russia, Iran and Israel, real or actual clashes that could spark a larger confrontation in just the past 2 years. Just yesterday, Trump stated his intent to drop out of the INF Accord as the macro strategy of political warfare in response to the deployment of the Russian intermediate range systems, and ostensibly due to the fact that the INF Treaty does not impact China's missile systems. China was kept out of the accord, of course. The original version of the INF Accord was going to leave missiles in Asia to counter China. That was wiped out because it was feared that those missiles could be brought back to Europe at some point, and so Gorbachev and Reagan decided to just wipe out all intermediate land-based missiles. But then the U.S. used sea-based missiles in the Bosnian War in 1995, and even though, well, I don't know what we need land-based missiles for like China because the sea-based missiles are there. So on Russia's part, Moscow claims it is not in violation of the INF agreement and points to U.S. missile defense systems in Europe that could theoretically be used to launch a first strike. So the claim and counterclaim doesn't end. This, what I call the security dialectic, continues to generate itself, and hybrid warfare simply makes it much worse. And what we need, if we want to prevent World War Trump, is totally flexible. We need to engage in force, and we go back to the last one. We need political, economic, military tools that press for sanctions and other constraints, but at the same time, we need to begin to forge incentives and alternatives to change Russian behavior and action. And this means a proper mix of sanctions and concessions. Now, I mentioned this is one possibility. You know, earlier it was said both Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 were listed. U.S. press said that NATO will make them members of the alliance. NATO has to draw back from that and begin to look towards ways to create a formally neutral and decentralized Ukraine, for example. That's the fact that Ukraine became independent, it declared neutrality, and yet the rivalry between the two sides has created the war that we're in right now. But without this continuation of political communications in accordance with Clausewitz's theory of political warfare, we will be in a ruin of the major power. Not too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gardner. So we'll continue with Professor Zika Turk from University of Ljubljana. You will lead the presentation today? Yes. But with some more accessible technology.